Salutations, lore seekers, and welcome to another episode of the Lost Archives, a Star Wars Legends lore series. So today, I am going to be talking about Vibro weapons and the various effects they have had on the Star Wars universe. But firstly, before I get into that, what exactly is a Vibro weapon? So essentially, a Vibro weapon is a family of weapons that utilise high-speed sonic vibrations to make standardised weapons potentially more devastating and damaging, specifically in terms of cutting power, which is why the more commonly known variant of the weapon is the Vibro dagger, Vibro blade and Vibro sword, though other variations do exist. It essentially works where the weapon in question has what's known as a small vibro generator built into either the hilt or the handle of the weapon. This sends out a high frequency pulse that could cause anything attached to the generator to emit extremely high frequency vibrations, which when connecting to, say, for example, armour, material or flesh, would destroy a large portion of the item in question, causing grievous wounds that wouldn't be, for example, sustained with a normal weapon. For example, a Vibro sword, whereas if you were to try and slash somebody in half, you might get stopped by the spine, because you don't have that much physical strength. With a Vibro sword, you would be able to cut clean through the spine, sever your enemy in two quite easily. Which essentially means, to quote, even the most glancing of blows can become a potentially gaping wound. Not something you really want to happen to you on the battlefield, but your enemies now. Now that is truly something that could turn the tide of the battle in yours and your force's favour. Obviously, with thicker grades of armour, this could still be a bit of a problem, as the standard Vibro weapon couldn't cut through heavy armour, though there was an upgrade that could be applied to it, which was known as a focused Vibro cell, and this allowed to hone the stabbing point of the weapon, which would then allow you to stab into more powerful armours. In fact, at this point, the weapon's potential was nearly as powerful as a lightsaber. It can still be blocked by certain things, but it is going to cut through most things you come across. That being said, a Vibro sword or Vibro weapon could not actually stop a lightsaber from penetrating it. Not unless, of course, they had a special material woven into the blade. In this case, I am referring to Echani cortosis blades. I'll be doing a video on the Echani culture and stuff at some point, but what they did is they would utilise a small amount of cortosis and create a weaved strand into the blade, which would then effectively allow it to parry and deflect lightsaber blades. This wouldn't have the usual drawbacks that a cortosis blade would have on a lightsaber, where it causes it to short out. This would just deflect the energy, because it wasn't made purely of cortosis, despite in the times when the Echani were forging these blades, cortosis being a more common material. It was still very expensive to refine. Now that we know a little bit more about what a Vibro weapon is, we'll now go on to the effect it's had on the galaxy. It's primarily seen use in most militaries as a backup weapon or close quarters combat weapon. For example, certain droids in the CIS or even the clone assassins were known for using Vibro weapons. But it has a very big impact on the crime syndicates of the universe. Due to their brutal efficiency, Vibro weapons in all shapes, sizes and configurations were used by a lot of the underworld organisations. This was mainly because it's much easier just to pull out a Vibro shield and puncture the armour of your victim before going rifling through their pockets. Whereas most bounty hunters as well would have some sort of shiv dagger variant of a Vibro weapon as their last resort weapon, if they needed it. Another version of it as well is the Vibro cutter, which was used heavily in mining. If you've played the KOTOR 2 video game, the actual torch, one of the weapons you can use is a Vibro cutter, which you use to battle through mining droids as well as various other things. Its traditional use was used to cut through various bits of rock and of material, generally to make it a bit more easier for the miner, so they wouldn't use too much strength having to hack and slash at the material. This meant that the miner could do a lot more work before eventually succumbing to fatigue, If you don't have to use as much strength to move a lot of material, you can do it for far, far longer. Then you'd go on to certain duelists or military groups that would use variants like the Vibro blade or the more heavier Vibro sword, which was used in more two-handed functions. Now, I'm going to go through and list a couple of each Vibro weapon. So we'll start off with the more commonly known Vibro blade. Now, the Vibro blade is usually just a blade equipped with a Vibro generator and is quite lighter than some of the other alternatives. So a lot of individuals prefer to use Vibro blades rather than, let's say, for example, a Vibro sword, because it allows for more agility and cleaner strikes in combat. Though this does give some disadvantage because you don't have as much stopping power in your strikes. Typically about 30 centimeters in length, and a lot of duelists, especially those who are heavily trained in dueling, would typically use two Vibro weapons. You then move on to the double-bladed variant, which was essentially two of them fused together and then would be used similarly to a lightsaber staff, saber staff as they're also known, or any double-bladed sword, or even a quarterstaff. Though, if you're not proficient in this type of weapon, you're going to be at a major disadvantage. If you are proficient, you're going to be cutting through enemies like there's no tomorrow. Moving on to the Vibro sword, it is essentially a bigger and heavier version of the Vibro blade, which does mean that you're going to have to forego using two of them. Typically, people would wield one with two hands, and the added bulk and weight would essentially mean that you could use more brute force instead of elegance. Though, to be fair, it could be wielded with dual forms, but you'd have to have the extra strength in order to do that. Typically though, if you are going to use one-handed, you would use a standard Vibro blade as your backup weapon, giving you the chance to parry and make quick counter strikes with the weapon, while still able to maintain a slight amount of agileness with the secondary weapon. There also exists the Vibro double sword. It is very much like the Vibro double blade, but it is a much more difficult weapon to wield due to its sheer bulk. Now, like with the previous Vibro double blade, with the right training you could overcome obstacles and become a truly deadly fighter. If you aren't trained in it, it's practically next to useless to you. You're more likely to do more damage to yourself or get taken out in a fight very quickly, and hey ho, ooh, I just got myself a free Vibro sword and whatever items are on your corpse. There were other variations of the Vibro sword and Vibro blade as well. Famously, the jagged Vibro blade, which was basically a standard Vibro blade, but instead of having a standard cutting edge, it would be jagged or serrated. It'd still work in the same way, but it'd deliver a less clean cut. It would function very much similar to how a Vibro sword was, but the vibrations in each one would act like its own small cutting power, which means it's going to be a bit of a more aggressive wound to deal with. Moving on, next would be the Vibro daggers, which actually were used by the Dark Troopers in the Galactic Empire, as well as the Vibro shiv, which made its way around all various criminal groups, and even various bounty hunters would use them as well. And then finally we move on to the Vibro knuckler. These are essentially a pair of knuckle dusters with a small Vibro generator on the side and small little protruded blades, each of them able to vibrate at the same frequency as regular Vibro blades, and cause extra slashing and piercing damage when you're punching up your opponent. Nasty, especially seeing as it was employed by a lot of pirates and mercenaries. Moving on next to the Vibro axe, which you'll have all seen actually in canon, in the hands of Jabba's Glomorian guards. Lando has actually briefly used one of these as well when he was pretending to be a guard on Jabba's palace. Now, these weapons function practically the same as a standard Vibro weapon, but they rely a heavily lot more on crushing power. What I mean by that is it's on the downswing with the weight of the weapon and your strength behind it that gives it the cutting strength. Due to the bulk of them, they were incredibly difficult to wield. But the other benefit of this weapon was it would strike fear into your opponents. Now, this weapon wouldn't actually require any upgrades to be able to cut through chunkier options. So, for example, most types of armour, this weapon would be the most useful option against if you can wield it properly, and you wouldn't need to have any upgrades done to it in order to be able to cut through the armour. In fact, I can remember back in the day, one of my players in one of my original D20 Star Wars game used one of these to cut through one of the rebels' gun turrets. That was a bit of a shock when he did that. He managed to cut through it quite easily, but yeah, it took special proficiencies to be able to wield that weapon. Anyway, getting back on track. Now, some underworld groups, for the majority of the time, just didn't bother powering up these weapons, just trying to show off their brute force and strength. Which is hilarious, seeing as that kind of negates the whole point of the weapon in the first place. You might as well have just saved the money and given them a standard axe. Another weapon that was usually found in the hands of Gamorrean guards as well, especially in Jabba's palace, was the Vibro lance. Now, this essentially had the Vibro cell focusing the point in the head of the lance so it could be used as a piercing weapon against armour and other hard targets. Next we have the Vibro mace, which is essentially incorporating the same technology as the Vibro axe, meaning that you are using the weight of the weapon on the downswing to give most of your crushing power. The whole point of the actual vibration technology is just to help you penetrate through thicker technologies. Due to the oversized nature of the Vibro maces, however, if you didn't know how to use them at all, they were next to useless to wield, and you would be causing more harm to yourself using them than you would be to your opponent. I think these were typically used by Neimoidian guards, or brutes, I think they were called in the game. If you've played Star Wars Episode 3 Revenge of the Sith on the PlayStation 2, when you actually do the level as Anakin to go and kill the Separatist leaders, Anakin has to battle, I think, about 3 of these things. And even those guys have a trouble, and they're supposedly trained to use them, have trouble wielding these weapons. And finally, moving on to the last but least, would be the weapon of the Black Sun Vigos, or the Vigo Lords as they are known, which was a whip, which was given the ability to use a Vibro generator. Now, the Black Sun Vigo is the only one who really has been proficient in that method to date in Legends canon, and it was essentially a light whip given a Vibro generator. Now, it did have a bit of a resistance to a lightsaber blade. This was due to the light whip nature of it. So there is a bit of conflict in canon with this particular weapon, because it's never really identified as a Vibro whip itself or a light whip, although there is also combinations of the two. I do like the idea of the two, however, it would come under the category of a hybrid weapon, and I'm not too sure how the Vibro generator would actually work on the light whip technology. Something to think about for the future, I suppose. Now to introduce a new section I'm going to do on when I do videos like this. My own personal preference for Vibro weapon would probably be the Vibro blade. With its quick and agile nature, it also makes it perfect for wielding with a shield. And not to mention, in the original KOTOR game, it was one of the best melee weapons I used until I got a lightsaber. If there was a way to keep using it afterwards, I'd probably end up using it as a offhand weapon to my lightsaber until I got a second one. This has been a brief introduction to Vibro weapons and how they do. I may in the future go over some of the more interesting ones, or perhaps even character-owned weapons and upgrades they've made to them, especially the Ichani variant of the Vibro weapons, but we'll see about that in the future. Well guys, this has been another episode of The Lost Archives. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you did, feel free to like, comment and subscribe. Maybe if you comment, you leave a bit of criticism so I get a bit of feedback and can just improve the channel as I go along. If you do subscribe, please feel free to hit the bell for notifications so you stay up to date with the channel. And I will catch you on the next episode of The Lost Archives. Have a good day guys, and take care.